It's blue watering mulching.
Yeah, looks good.
Okay, oops, wait a second. Wait a second. Okay, there we go. So I'm gonna start. So my name is Martine and I live in Ayr. And I am not a full master gardener yet. I'm a master gardener in training. And what that means is that I have not yet written the final exam, but I do community hours and I help consult with gardens. And I have gardened for 30, 40 years. I've been a gardener. So I have a lot of practical experience. So master gardeners in training have to take a series of courses through the University of Guelph, the agriculture studies. So I'm in my last courses and I will be writing the exam in the fall, and then I will be a full master gardener. So I have to say, I'm not one yet, but I do have a lot of life experience, and Anne has vetted my information. So, so you don't have to worry that I'm sharing something that isn't right. So I'll get started. So watering and mulching. I asked to speak on this because in fact, watering is absolutely critical because everything to sustain life, to survive and grow. And your plants lose their water during transpiration every day, and it needs to be replaced. So there's some important things to remember having to do with watering, and that's when and how often. The optimal time is usually early morning or early evening. And there's reasons for that, because in the summer months, the sun is really hot. And what happens is if you get water on the foliage, it tends to lens and you'll get spots. And it actually causes stress on the plants. It causes them to lose more moisture if they're watered during the hot part of the day. And it's actually, I mean, unless a plant is in full, then it's a good idea to just wait until the sun is not as hot. So morning is absolutely best, or if you want to do it early so that the foliage has a chance to dry out, because wet foliage is a breeding for diseases and pests. So it's a good idea to water early in the evening so that if it's not too humid, then the plants have a chance to dry out. And then the other thing that's important to note is apply the water gradually, especially if it's gotten really dried out. Because if you can imagine, let's say there's been a period of quite a lot of dry, and then you get those big torrents of rain, and really the ground is so dry that it just runs off and it doesn't have a chance to absorb. So if you water gradually, it gives the soil a chance to absorb it, so that then the soil accepts the water better, and so you get deeper watering, which is important. How much to water? Are you able to see, or am I in the way of these slides? I'm going to move this over here maybe. Okay, so it depends how much water. There's a lot of things to consider. Overwatering will kill a plant faster than underwatering. Plants are better able to withstand stress if their roots are deep. You're not going to get deep roots on plants if you water too frequently, because it encourages them to grow shallow roots, and that's not a good thing. So a slight drying of the soil is okay. It encourages that deep root growth. Now, containers, on the other hand, do need extra care and watering in heat and dry of the summer because they're out of the ground, they do tend to dry out faster. So they do need a little bit more watering than your perennials or your garden plants actually in the dirt. So testing soil for moisture. So Anne told me that you like it has, this can't be, we don't want to get too technical and boring. So she said, make sure that they're easy tips and tricks. So for me, this is something that you see gardeners do instinctively. And there's a reason why they do that. How do you test for soil moisture? You stick your fingers. If you've ever seen people who garden a lot, or even yourself, you might do it. You stick your fingers in the pot, or you stick your fingers in the dirt. Well, you do that to test for moisture. So it's the best tool that you always have on hand that will give you feedback right away as to the dryness of the soil. So let's say for a garden bed and it's established plants, maybe perennials, what I do is I will put my finger in the soil up to the second knuckle, index finger to the second knuckle. Do you feel moisture? You could probably wait. Now, new plantings and containers, I measure from the first knuckle. If I stick my finger into the first knuckle and I still feel moist, you're good. You don't need to water right now. For newly sown seed beds, let's say you've just sown some vegetable seeds in your trug or in the soil on the ground, those need water as soon as the surface has dried, because those seeds need moisture constantly in order to germinate. Those need a lot of care. What I tend to do is I have a big handheld sprayer, and I have it on mist, and I will give them a misting 2-3 times a day, just to keep those seeds nice and wet, so that until they germinate. Then the other thing is, oh, I got a spelling mistake. You have to mulch your young plant. That really helps minimize evaporation. So that's also a key. And we're going to talk about mulching a little bit later too. So, do we water by hand or do we irrigate? So there's some good and there's some bad systems. So lots of times I see oscillating sprinklers sitting on
I
the
don't
lawn.
want to
Wait,
play. No.
hello? Say that again. Oh, I thought I heard you ask a question. So I have oscillating sprinklers. Let's say you put it on your lawn, it goes back and forth. Those are okay, but they're not very efficient. I prefer not to use them for garden beds. They're fine for turf, if you want to get your grass, but I find that they're not necessarily efficient for perennial beds or vegetable beds. So now, some people have combination systems. So watering can is great for your containers, but your perennial beds or your vegetable beds, you might want to use a hose. So combination systems usually are what works. That's what I use. So I have a combination of systems. So I have a pretty big property. So I have a little more than half an acre. So for me, I can't possibly water everything with a watering can. A hose is what I use to water my vegetable gardens and my trug. I have to grow all of my vegetables above the ground because of rabbits. So I use that for my trugs. I use watering cans for my containers. And I don't know about you guys, but for me, my pet peeve is garden hoses. They just always kink and they're a pain in the butt. And I just hate hoses, but they're a part of our lives. So what I do in my gardens is I always follow the same path when I'm pulling my hose along. So I have rocks at all of the points where I know the hose is going to run. And those rocks kind of catch that hose and it keeps it from dragging across the beds, because it's nothing worse than just planting a lot of annuals, or you've got some young vegetables in your bed and you pull the hose and it runs across and breaks things off. So I like to have those rocks strategically placed. And I've seen them also at Lee Valley. So if your garden doesn't work having rocks in it, they do have those hose leaders and they kind of look like a hook, and Lee Valley sells them and they're unobtrusive and they actually catch that hose so that it doesn't run across your beds, because that's a shame when that happens. Now, to me, the very best efficient watering systems are the buried drip or bubblers. And they're super efficient and they conserve a lot of water. Now on the slide, you can see a little picture down at the bottom left. And what that is that's one of those Gardena's quick connects connected to a Y and 2 soaker hoses that are buried. And I just buried those using just a garden edger. Just lift the sod, stick the hose under, lift the sod, stick the hose under, and that's buried all the way around. And then when I feel that that particular tree needs water, I just drag my hose out, quick connect with the Gardena connector, and I'm good to go. I don't have to lay the hose out. I don't have to leave the hose on the lawn, because sometimes they do burn the grass if you leave them out on a hot day. And it just stays buried there for years before I have to replace the hose. It works really well for me. And it's actually low enough in the grass that I can run the lawnmower over it and it doesn't touch it. So that's another idea of a combination system. Now, another really efficient system, drip irrigation. So if you have a localized garden, like a vegetable garden bed, these are amazing. And there's a little bit of upfront cost to get the rain barrels and the hoses, but they are free because if it rains, those rain barrels fill up. And it uses simple gravity to distribute water via soaker hose to all of your vegetables, and it's free water from the sky. So it works well if you have a localized garden. Now, if you have, it's not a viable option for large properties or many garden beds, because I have a few big perennial beds. Well, I wouldn't be able to use this system because there's not enough PSI to run the water everywhere. But for a vegetable garden, it's a terrific solution for keeping those vegetables watered inexpensively and efficiently. So a note about trees. Now, I have quite a few trees in my garden, and some of the trees are ornamentals, and they're very important to me because they play an important role for shade and they house birds. And I hate to see my trees suffer. So I'm always checking to make sure that there's adequate moisture and feeding for those trees, because you don't want them to be under stress. There's enough stress of wind and storms and insects that you don't need to add to the stress by letting them dry out. So especially newly planted trees. New planted trees need water every day for the first couple of weeks after they've been planted. Established trees have deeper roots, so they can go for extended periods. However, they can get to the point where they do need that extra drink. Now, in my yard, I think not last year. Last year had plenty of rain, but the year before we had, I think, a whole month where we didn't have any rain, and I had to water my trees. So now, don't forget about your trees during extended periods of dry, because they do need that extra water given to them because they can only withstand so much dry. So the other key is always water at the drip line, because that's where the roots, the feeder roots will be. Here's a tip and trick. How do I know if my trees need water? So what I do is I just use a screw, because that's something most people have in their house. And you stick it in the ground. So if it goes in the ground easily, then that means that there's adequate moisture. So I poke it in the soil. If it goes in easily up to about 6 inches and then resists, it might be time to give it some water. It works best in clay and loam, but sandy soil, it'll still work. So how much water does a tree need? Well, believe it or not, a tree needs about 10 gallons of water for every inch in diameter of the tree. So, for example, if your tree is big and it has a 25-inch diameter trunk, that's 250 gallons of water. That's a lot of water. So how do you measure 250 gallons of water? A 5-gallon pail, like a big Home Depot pail or a sea pail. Fill it with your hose, add a trickle, or whatever speed you want to run it at, and you just do the math. So if you want 250 gallons of water and your hose runs at 4 minutes, that's 3.5 hours of watering. And that's what I did. I have a weeping willow, and it gets 3.5 hours of water when I feel it needs it. It didn't need it last year. It needed it a lot the year before. I think I watered it 3 times the year before. Before that, I think we had adequate rainfall. So it's not like you have to do it every week, but it is something to be mindful of if you have trees and you want to keep them healthy. I have a soaker hose that's buried, but if you have a hose, you just lay it on the grass, then you want to move it around the drip line to make sure that you get good coverage. Okay, so some people will say, oh, it's been really dry. It's been really dry. Well, that's anecdote. Has it been really dry? So what is a drought? So it's a deficiency in precipitation. So meteorologically, a slight drought is 25% less than normal, 50% is a moderate, more than 50% is a severe. So familiarize yourself with conditions in your area. So the Weather Network, I love the Weather Network because it will tell you average rainfall for, I think it's 15 years in the past. So you can look up average rainfall for the month of July for 15 years in the past, do an average, use your rain gauge, measure the rainfall, keep track of it in your garden journal, because you should all have garden journals. I have one and I refer to it all the time. Keep track. Did it rain? Didn't it rain? I think it rained. Did it rain 2 weeks ago? I can't remember. Check it. Check your journal. And that way you'll know, did it rain or didn't it? Check with your finger. Does it need it? Doesn't it? Use the tools that you have. And that way you'll get to the point where you just know by feeling, I think we have to add water. I think we're good. It becomes second nature. So that's what it is with me. But that takes practice and logging and keeping track of observational data. So I have a rain gauge. My rain gauge, the past 2 days we've had a phenomenal amount of rain, and my rain gauge shows 3 inches, which is crazy. That's a ton of rain. So I'm not even going to think about watering for at least a week, especially because the temperatures have been low. So it's one of those things that you get to the point where you just know by feel if you need it or if you don't. So what's next? Oh, so we can't really talk about rain requirements unless we talk about soil types, because there's all different kinds of soil types out there. You hear people say, oh, I have clay soil, I have sandy soil. So what does all that mean? Well, we know there's something called a soil horizon, and that's all of the different layers of soil that's under the ground. And our plants grow in that first 10 to 15 inches. The roots might go as deep as 30, but they might be as shallow as 8, depending on the plant. So we want that water targeted where the roots are. How does that water get there? It depends on your soil type. Soil texture and type plays a huge role in how fast the soil will drain water and how fast it dries out. So sandy soils drain very quickly. Clay soils drain very slowly. So the pore size, which is that texture, affects the ease of root penetration and water penetration. So an ideal soil is a 40-40-20, which is 40 sand, 40 silt, 20 clay in percentages. So that's an ideal soil mix. Not everybody has that ideal, but I would love it. So it depends on your soil type, how fast your soil drains. So, oh, here's a fun one. So, and I can send this out, or I can send out this link. You can just Google it, because I show at the bottom where you can get it. So how do you do a soil texture text? Well, you can do it yourself. It's an easy do-it-yourself thing. So most people would have mason jars or a peanut butter jar or something. So it's a 2-cup jar. So you can fill it about 1/3 to 1/2 full with soil from your garden. So you want to dig down a bit, about 6 inches deep, and get a good sample. So you fill the jar half with soil, and you need a ruler or a measuring tape, and you measure the soil in your jar. So let's say you've put 2 inches worth of soil in your jar. Fill the jar to the shoulder with water and let it sit until all the water gets absorbed. Then put the lid on and shake it good for about 3 minutes. Then set it down and don't move it. Time it. So you watch it, and you can actually watch the sand and the silt filter down. After 1 minute, measure the amount of sediment that's collected at the bottom. This is the sand. So the sand will fall first because it's the coarsest and the biggest particles. So you measure that. So let's just say you have 2 inches. So let's say the first inch is sand. Great. So you mark that down. I've got 1 inch. Then you wait 4 more minutes. Measure it again. And it will be greater than 1 inch now. So it might be, say, 1.5 inches or 1.75 inches. That difference is your silt, because silt has a smaller particle than sand, but a bigger particle than clay. Then wait 24 hours, don't move the jar. Then you'll see the layer of clay on top. Now I did mine, and I have almost no clay in my soil. I live in air and everything is just sand and rock. So then that third measurement will be, so for me, I have, say, in any part of my where there's just trees and it's not gardens and the gardens have not, that area has not been amended, I have 60, 35, 5, 60% sand, 35% silt, 5% clay, which is really not very good for growing anything. My garden beds, however, because I've been amending and amending, have a 50, 30, 20, which is pretty good because ideal is 40, 40, 20. So that's a great thing you can do. You can do it with kids or grandkids. It's a fun little activity. And if you want more instructions on how to do it, just go to Old Farmer's Almanac, 3 simple do-it-yourself soil tests. So that's kind of a fun thing you can do maybe if you're interested in testing your soil texture. Okay, so then I talked about amending soil. So sandy soil, that's what I have. How do you improve it? Add humus, aged manure, peat moss, sawdust, add some extra nitrogen, maybe grass clippings. Heavy clay-rich soil can also be added to improve your soil if it's sandy. If you have predominantly silty, you want coarse sand and gravel and compost, or manure, horse or sheep mixed with straw, and that will lighten your soil up a little bit. If you have clay soil, you're going to want to add peat moss, sand, and compost. So what you want to do is whichever soil you've got, whatever it leans the most towards, you want to bring it back to that ideal 40, 40, 20. So what's next is pH, because we're going to be talking about mulches next. And pH is a key thing to talk about when you're talking about mulching. So what that is the level of acidity in your soil. So sandy soil is low on the pH scale, but tends to be a bit more acidic. Clay is high on the pH scale. It tends to be a bit more alkaline. So you can easily do a soil test to find out your pH. They're not expensive. You can get them at Canadian Tire. So what's important about this is some types of mulches can raise or lower your pH values. So it's a good idea to know this if your soil tends to be acidic or alkaline. It may affect your choice of mulch. So the pH scale, so way down by the zeros is acid. So like battery acid is a 0. In the middle is neutral. Pure water is neutral. And that would be a 7. So household bleach would be a 10. Oven cleaner would be a 13. So low pH is acidic, high pH is alkaline. Many of your garden plants like to be right in that green area, right around the neutral. Some prefer a bit to the acidic, some prefer a bit to the alkaline. Most of them, like we humans, like that neutral zone. Some you can affect their color. Let's say hydrangeas. If you acidify the soil, you can get blue hydrangeas. So some plants prefer an alkaline. So when you get them and you plant them, you might want to look and see what kind of soil you have, and if that plant is likely to succeed in your soil type. So pH is kind of an important thing to know about. So mulches. So it's pretty easy. Was it alive once or wasn't it? So an organic mulch could be shredded bark, bark nuggets, shredded leaves, compost, grass clippings, straw, even wood ashes. I have a wood burning stove, and sometimes I put ashes in my garden. Inorganics can be river rock, pea gravel, landscape fabric, chipped rubber. Sometimes you can get like a chipped recycled rubber. Depends on what you're looking to do with your mulch. So what do you want to achieve? So mulch preserves moisture and reduces erosion. Are you mulching just for aesthetics? Do you want to amend the soil? Do you want to mulch every year, or do you want to mulch infrequently? Because it can be expensive. I know I have to buy a lot of mulch. I don't want to mulch every year, and I don't feel that I need to. So if you're buying an organic mulch, let's say a bark mulch, and it's expensive, and it breaks down slowly, then maybe mulching every other year or every 3 years is good enough. Maybe you don't want to do it every year. So those are some of the questions that you want to ask yourself. What do you want to achieve? Cedar and pine, shredded bark or bark nuggets are the most common. Those are the ones you see in bags at the Home Depots, and they're easy to get. They smell nice. Pine ages better than cedar. Cedar tends to get a little bit sort of gray, kind of like an old pressure treated fence, let's say. It kind of gets all gray, which is okay if you don't mind the way it looks. But I find that pine keeps its color better. It's a little bit more acidic and it'll break down faster. So it's okay for slightly alkaline soils. But it's important that you buy it from a reputable vendor. So one year I bought mulch. I got what I thought was a good deal years ago, and it had insects in it. And boy, was I sorry. So you want to make sure, believe it or not, you want to make sure that you want to get there, you want to get your hands into it, smell it, check it for insects, check it for molds. Sometimes wood mulches can have molds in them. Like a white mold is not a good thing. Sometimes they have yellow, and yellow is actually not a bad thing. It's just a decomposition. And if you put it down in your garden and you see the yellow molds, just mix light vinegar water and you'll get rid of it. And it's not harmful. But you want to be careful that you get mulch that does not have insects in it, because then you just have a way bigger problem than dry gardens. Okay, so there's other organic mulches and they can be super economical. Let's say you have a lot of deciduous trees on your property and you get a lot of leaves in the fall. Well, shredded or partially decomposed leaves are amazing as a mulch in the garden. Some people like to use grass clippings. They don't look beautiful. They add a lot of nitrogen, which your plants like. You can use compost. I have a digester in my backyard that's just for yard waste. And it's a 3-stage, and the compost is amazing on the garden, and it enriches the soil, and it does work to help keep weeds down. In vegetable gardens, often people use straw. It's very inexpensive. It works well in vegetable gardens, but it does blow away because it's so light. So you might have to do it. It might blow away on you, and you will need to reapply it probably later in the season because it decomposes pretty quick. Wood ashes, as I said, you can do it, and they're very high in nutrients, but they can be a bit unsightly, and they are. If I put wood ashes, it's something, because burning season is usually winter, I will put wood ashes in my garden in the winter time, but in the spring I dig it in and put a different mulch on top because it doesn't look very nice. But it is high in nutrients, so it could be something that you might want to add. In organics, river rock is beautiful. I think it looks just lovely. Like in this picture, have bands of river rock. It's aesthetically pleasing, lasts forever, but it is not maintenance free. It will eventually sprout weeds. As organic matter falls between the stones and it decomposes, and it's a bed for growing weeds. So there is maintenance every 2 or 3 years. You have to pull out all the rock, do a really good weeding, put it all back. But it looks beautiful. I love the way it looks. Same goes for pea gravel or the synthetic bark chips. You can get the rubber ones. They last forever. And there's just a little bit of maintenance in between, and you don't have to buy it every year. And if you're not necessarily buying mulch to amend your soil, you don't want it to break down. You want it to last. So it's an option. Landscape fabric. Okay, landscape fabric has its goods and its bads. So I don't use landscape fabric because I have perennial beds. So if you can imagine trying to wallpaper around plants, it's not easy. And you'll have to put something on top of it. So let's say you put landscape fabric, you put mulch on top of it. Well, the mulch will move like through rain and pests and rabbits, and then your landscape fabric is exposed. So it's a little bit unsightly. So you sometimes see it used commercially or in a brand new bed. Let's say you're building a garden bed that has just foundation plantings like shrubs, and you're not really interested in planting perennials or annuals, and you're going to put bands of river rock. Perfect, that works. But if you want to move plants around or plant annuals every year, landscape fabric will not be a very good choice for you. So it depends on what you're looking to achieve. When is the best time to mulch? Late spring. In the early spring, everybody wants to get in the garden and they order their mulch and they start to put it down. But it's actually, it could be a detriment. So what it does is it keeps the cool in and it slows the warming up in your soil. So you're not needing to mulch for moisture retention because spring has ample moisture. So it isn't necessary for that. And if you have a perennial bed, they're going to start to emerge and you may smother them with some of that new mulch. So if they haven't yet emerged, you risk burying them and preventing them from sprouting, which would be a shame. So you want to do it late in the spring before the heat of the summer. And you're going to have newly turned soil in which to plant your new plantings, and then you mulch around it. That's the best time. So prepping your garden beds, always weed before you mulch. Mulching over weeds is just going to make it more difficult later. They're going to come through. So they will inevitably poke through, and then you're going to have to weed anyway. So I weed right before I mulch. So I do bed by bed. I go through, do a nice weeding, put the mulch on top, and I don't cultivate. So cultivating disturbs the surface. And so there's a bajillion seeds, weed seeds in your garden. And by cultivating, it brings them up to the surface so that they can germinate. So no-till and mulching, for me, makes my gardens really easy to maintain. I never till, I never cultivate. I pull the weeds, mulch on top, and I have a lot of garden beds. And once a week I pass through and pull little bits of weeds, and that's all I have to do. And how much? Oh, here's another tip. So how much do you need? Optimum depth is 1 inch to 3 inches based on the type of the mulch. So the finer the mulch, the less you need. The coarser the mulch, the more you need. So if you go with the big bark, like the big hunks of bark, then you're going to probably have to go 3 inches deep. How to calculate? Measure your garden beds and round up. You always need more than you think. So let's say, for example, you have a garden bed that's 10 feet by 10 feet, 2 inches deep. That's a cubic yard. A cubic yard is 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet. So let's say you order your mulch from the big yellow bag. Then how many yards is in that? Calculate, order the right number of bags. I have a lot of gardens, and so I order my mulch by the truckload, and they dump it in my driveway, and for 3 days or a week, I work at moving that mulch. So it's more economical because I need so much of it. Buying bags would just be quite a bit more expensive because you got to pay for the bagging. So that's how I do it. Mulch volcanoes, it could be very damaging for the tree. So you see people pile the mulch too high. So what that means is that trunk is going to get way too much moisture building up against it. So it's a place for the trunk to rot. Diseases, insects, anything can get in there, and it weakens the roots. So if you want to mulch around your trees, that's fine, but no thicker than what you do in your normal garden, just 1 to 2 inches, and that's sufficient. And that's the end. So does anybody have any questions? And I guess I should not be presenter anymore.
Whichever you prefer. That was that was so good. Thank you for sharing all of that information. I was not expecting all the stuff on mulch and pH levels. Like, that was fantastic. So thank you for putting that much work into it. I really appreciate it.
Good. I'm glad you enjoyed it. So does anybody
I have a question.
Yes.
I have a question. So you talked about watering at the very beginning and not to get it on the actual plant. My mom always said that that getting water on the leaves if the sun was out would allow the plant to get sunburnt. So I don't know. Is that?
Yes. That's
okay.
Yep. That's what I meant when I said by lensing. So then the water droplets sitting on the leaves will act like a lens, and the sun will burn the leaves.
Okay. I didn't quite pick that up. So, okay. Yep. So that is true then.
That is absolutely true. And some plants really, like, for example, the first one that comes to mind is basil. So let's say you have basil or basil, however you want to say it, in your garden, you're growing herbs. It hates having wet leaves. So it's better to always water basil at the bottom.
At the
Don't
bottom.
get the leaves wet at any time. It doesn't like it. It promotes like a sort of a black spot fungus. So if some of your basil gets that, it could be that the leaves got wet. They don't like having wet leaves. Some herbs don't care. Like for example, parsley, my God, you could pull it out and leave it on your deck and it'll grow. But basil is one that doesn't like having wet leaves. So some plants actually suffer from it.
Yeah, I would think a nightshade like a cucumber or something like that. They probably don't like, because they,
Right.
yeah,
Yep. Yep. So watering from underneath is always best. And that's the rule as well for seedlings. So if you're starting your garden, your vegetables indoors, from seed, always water from the bottom, because especially very young seedlings, they can suffer from something called damping off. And if you water at the soil level instead of from under, then they get like a fungus on the surface. Even if you use a soilless mix, they can still suffer from damping off. So it's always a good idea to water from underneath. And that's good because then you don't risk damping off. And also it promotes the roots to grow down, which is what you want.
yeah. Also with the mulching around the tree. So I always knew not to put, to pile it up around the roots, but you see lots of people, they kind of pile it up and then they pull it away around the roots. So
Yeah,
it's kind of like
That's
this,
okay.
this swimming pool around it, but it's not actually on the roots.
Yeah, I mean,
okay.
it's not terribly, it's kind of unsightly, but at least it's better than piling it against the trunk.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, yeah. And some people do that for newly planted trees. They'll make like a little sort of like a little well around
Yeah.
the outside. And
Yeah.
that kind of helps to get that, because if it's a brand new tree, it's probably little. So it needs that water to soak in right where the roots are, because the root ball won't be big on a
Right.
little tree. Yeah. And sometimes you see like the city here, when they plant new trees, they have watering bags. Have you ever seen those? They fill them with water and then
Yeah.
they just trickle really slow.
Yeah, I've seen those. Yeah.
Yep. Yep.
That just saves them having to come around more often. Right? Yeah.
That's right.
Makes
Yep.
good sense though.
It does.